Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at modal ontological arguments, and these are a set of arguments that are similar to Anselm's argument, but they employ modal logic. I want to look at these arguments today from a critical point of view, from a Christian perspective, and want to evaluate these in light of some of the things that we discussed in Anselm's argument. If you're not familiar with that, check it out in the link below. And I want to really assess this argument and really think about what implications it does have on Christian thought. These arguments are based on a kind of logic called modal logic. Now, modal logic is a kind of logic that deals with necessities and possibilities. I want to go into what these are briefly to kind of give you a primer on what necessities are and what possibilities are, so you'll understand an argument when I present it in just a moment. First thing I want to talk about is possibility. Now, possibility is the idea that something exists in a possible world, and this is typically how it's expressed. So a dragon, for instance, might exist in some possible world. A dragon, though, doesn't exist in every possible world. And it also might be true that something exists in the actual world but doesn't exist in all possible worlds. For instance, I might exist in the actual world, but I don't exist in all possible worlds. There might be a possible world in which I don't exist. A necessary truth or necessity is something that is true in all possible worlds. So 2 + 2 = 4 is such a proposition that is true in all possible worlds. So we call this a necessary truth. Now, where this comes to bear with the existence of God is whether or not God is a necessary truth or whether God is a possible truth or something else entirely. And this is what ontological arguments are attempting to establish, is whether or not God exists by using modal logic. And typically the trick is to assert that God exists in some possible world and therefore exists in all possible worlds. So let's look at an example ontological argument in a modal form to express this idea. At the risk of creating a straw man of the modal ontological argument, I'm going to present a form of it that's fairly easy to follow and then offer some critique of it that I think will apply to all modal ontological arguments. Like Anselm's argument, this one starts with a definition of God that says God is maximally great. And this is essentially affirming God as a definition is maximally great in all his attributes. His omnipotence, his omnibenevolence, and so on are at their maximal potential. There can be nothing greater than the attributes ascribed to God. The second premise flows from this that says, if God is maximally great, God would exist necessarily. So this is essentially affirming God as a necessary truth. But what this is doing is simply arguing about definitions at this point. It really hasn't done anything to actually show that these definitions are compatible with an actual world or actual reality. One could start with these two premises and argue against the existence of God and show that these are actually incompatible with the actual world. And that's what some attempt to do with modal ontological arguments against the existence of God. But in any case, some have tried to conflate the second premise with the conclusion of this argument to say that this one implies existence. But at this point, we haven't really said anything about existence. It's simply just saying definitions, and that's really what this is working from, something like what Anselm's argument did. But starting in the third premise is where this attempts to really argue for the existence of God by saying it is possible that God exists in some possible worlds. Now, this is very similar to what we said about the dragon earlier. Now, this premise by itself doesn't say anything about God in all possible worlds. It's just saying that one can imagine a world in which God exists, and that is some possible world. That isn't too controversial at this point because the world that this is talking about, or the worlds that this is talking about, may or may not be actual worlds, and it's not saying anything about all possible worlds yet. That comes in premise 4, which brings together the second and third premise when it says, if God exists in some possible world, then God exists in all possible worlds. So that's essentially applying modal logic from the necessity of God as a truth to the third premise that says if it's possible that God exists in some possible worlds, then by the rules of modal logic, it follows that God exists in all possible worlds. Now, where this butts up against reality is in the fifth premise, where it says the actual world is a possible world. So it's saying that the actual world is in the set of possible worlds that is being described by the fourth premise. And so with that in mind, it brings together the fourth and fifth premise to say that if God exists in the actual world, God exists. So it's saying the actuality of a possible world implies the actuality of God, and therefore the argument concludes that God exists. Now that we've given an overview of this argument, let's critique it. This argument, I think, suffers from the same kinds of problems that Anselm's argument suffered from. What Anselm did was make an assertion a priori about the actual world when he said it is greater to exist in reality than to exist as an idea. Now, this is a value judgment that is made a priori that really can't be grounded in the actual world without actually making the argument circular. Or if he was to do it strictly a priori, it's at best a dubious claim. So I think this one does the same thing. It just buries it in the modal logic. And where it butts up against reality is in the fifth premise, where it says the actual world is a possible world. In and of itself, that's not controversial. The actual world is a possible world, obviously, because it has been actualized. The possible worlds, though, here are really described in the third premise, where it makes an a priori claim about the possible worlds that are indeed possible when it says it is possible that God exists in some possible worlds. That is an a priori claim similar to the one that Anselm made, where he says that it is greater to exist in reality than to exist merely as an idea. So in the same way that Anselm was making a claim about some reality, this argument is doing something similar to that by defining possible worlds. And the assumption here that this is making is assuming something about the actual world in the premises about possible worlds. It's assuming that the actual world is indeed compatible with that set of possible worlds a priori rather than a posteriori. Now, if one was to say that this is really an a posteriori judgment, then I think it would be doing exactly what Anselm's argument does, and they would ultimately just really be defining possible worlds as worlds in which God exists. And I don't think that's valid without making this argument circular. But if you do it strictly a priori, then again, it's just a dubious claim. So either way you go, I don't think it's really a good argument to make these kinds of claims about possible worlds and assume that the actual world is indeed a possible world. Given this, though, I don't know that this argument is without value. I think it really does bring some things to the forefront about what is possible, what isn't possible, what are a priori truths that are necessary truth, and so on and so forth. And these kinds of conversations can be made, and I think these kinds of conversations are very interesting conversations because it really deals in epistemology rather than trying to establish anything ontologically. And that's a conversation for another day that I want to do a video on. But for now, I'm going to leave this where it is, that I don't think that the modal version of the ontological argument is really any better than Anselm's version of the ontological argument. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and then clicking on the bell icon to receive notifications when new content becomes available. You can also follow us on Twitter @AbideDevo. And as always, thank you for watching.